It was late summer of 2016, and I was 33 years old. My wife, Hannah, was 31. We had been married for almost 4 years, and by then we were both working jobs that kept us indoors far too often. She worked in an office as a graphic designer, and I was doing long shifts at a manufacturing plant. We needed a break, something away from phones, computers, and the noise of town. Camping seemed like the perfect escape. We chose a spot in northern Michigan, far from the usual tourist campgrounds. I had found a mention of it on an old outdoors forum, a backcountry clearing near the Osable River, about a 2-mile hike from where we could park the car. The directions weren't exact, but that was part of what appealed to me. It was secluded, quiet, and as close to off the grid as we could get without flying out west. That Saturday morning, we packed the car with our gear, tent, sleeping bags, a cooler with food, a small camp stove, and the usual extras like flashlights and a hatchet. Hannah teased me for bringing too much, but I've always had the habit of overpacking. We left home around 9 a.m., drove for almost 5 hours, and pulled off the main highway onto a dirt road that seemed more like a forgotten logging trail. By the time we parked, the air felt heavy and sticky, the way it gets before rain. We shouldered our packs, locked the car, and started the hike. The path wasn't well marked, but the old forum post had mentioned a narrow trail running along the riverbank, and after pushing through some underbrush, we found it. The hike was quiet. No other campers, no voices, not even distant sounds of traffic. Just the river moving steadily beside us and the buzzing of insects in the thick trees. When we finally reached the clearing, it felt like we had stepped into a hidden pocket of the woods. A soft patch of grass spread out near the water. Tall pines surrounded it like walls, and there was already a fire ring of stones in the center. Whoever had been there before us hadn't left any trash behind, which made me like the spot even more. We set up the tent facing the river, unrolled our sleeping bags inside, and then gathered some wood before the sun went down. The air grew cooler by the water, and Hannah wrapped herself in a hoodie while I built the fire. By dark, we were cooking hot dogs on sticks and sharing a can of beer. Everything felt calm, exactly the kind of break we'd wanted. But later that night, the quiet changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning. At first, I thought it was the sound of the river that pulled me out of sleep, but then I realized it wasn't steady water. It was footsteps. Slow, uneven crunches moving through the brush just outside the tent. My first thought was deer. This was Michigan, after all, and deer moved through the woods all the time. I held still, waiting for it to pass, but the steps didn't move off. They circled. One set of crunches along the left side, then a pause, then another set of crunches along the back of the tent. My chest tightened. It didn't sound like 4 legs on leaves. It sounded like someone walking. I stayed frozen, listening. Hannah was still asleep beside me, breathing slow and even. I didn't want to wake her until I was sure. The footsteps moved again, now toward the river. I heard something shift against the rocks near the fire pit, then silence. I waited. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. Finally, after what felt like forever, the sound faded. I stayed awake until the first hint of dawn bled into the trees. When Hannah stirred, I told her we probably had a raccoon or something near camp in the night, but inside I wasn't convinced. That morning I walked the edges of the clearing, looking for tracks. The ground was soft near the fire ring, and there were clear impressions, boots. Human. Someone had been there, walking around our tent while we slept. I didn't tell Hannah. I didn't want to ruin the trip for her. Instead, I suggested we take a long walk upriver during the day, and we did. We hiked, ate lunch on a log, and even swam in a shallow bend. For a while, I let myself relax, but that evening the unease returned. When the sun dipped low and the woods grew darker, I couldn't stop scanning the tree-line. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, felt louder, closer. Hannah tried to read by the firelight, but I barely touched my food. We went into the tent earlier that night. I kept a flashlight beside me, along with the hatchet. I told myself it was just in case of animals, but I knew the real reason. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. Instead, I saw light, a faint, flickering glow filtering through the thin nylon of the tent. At first, I thought our campfire had somehow restarted, but then I realized it was moving, drifting between the trees like someone walking with a lantern or flashlight. My throat went dry. The glow passed along the tree-line, paused, then disappeared. I lay rigid, straining to hear. Nothing. Then, minutes later, I heard it. The same slow crunch of footsteps circling again. I shook Hannah gently awake. She stirred, confused, until she heard it too. Her eyes widened in the dim light. We both stayed silent, listening to whoever it was step around our camp for what felt like half an hour. At one point, something brushed against the corner of the tent. Finally, the sound moved off toward the river again. We waited, not daring to move, until exhaustion pulled us back into restless sleep. The first light, we packed up. Neither of us said much. I checked the fire ring again and found fresh footprints in the damp earth, larger than my own boot size. They weren't there the day before. Someone had been standing only a few feet from where we cooked dinner. The hike back to the car felt endless. Every snapping twig behind us made me turn around, but nothing followed. When we finally reached the car and locked the doors, both of us let out shaky breaths we'd been holding the whole way back. On the drive home, with the woods fading behind us, the weight of it settled in. It hadn't been animals, and it hadn't been our imagination. Someone had been out there in the dark with us, circling our tent, watching. They hadn't said a word or shown themselves, but they wanted us to know they were there. We never went back to that spot. In fact, Hannah hasn't agreed to camp anywhere without other people nearby since. For me, the memory still comes back whenever I'm outside at night. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps in dry leaves, circling, waiting. What scared me most wasn't what they did. It was what they didn't do. Whoever was out there could have come closer, could have spoken, could have done something. Instead, they just walked around us in the dark, letting us know that we weren't alone, and that they were the ones deciding how the night would end. I had been wanting to get away from work for a while, and in the summer of 2017, I finally made the decision to take a week off and head out camping by myself. I was 29 at the time, living in Ohio, and I picked a spot in southern Kentucky near the Daniel Boone National Forest. I had camped plenty of times before, but always with friends or my brother. This time, I wanted the kind of quiet you only get when you're completely alone. No phones, no noise, no schedules, just me, a tent, and the woods. I left early in the morning, my little hatchback packed with a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a small cooler, and a single burner stove. I had printed maps and written directions in case I lost cell service, which I knew was likely. By early afternoon, I had found a dirt pull-off near a narrow trail that led down toward a small creek. The sun was out and the air was thick with summer humidity, the kind where your shirt clings to your back just from walking a few minutes. I hiked down maybe half a mile before I found a good flat area under a cluster of big sycamore trees. The creek bent close enough that I could hear the water moving over rocks, but not so close that I'd be worried if it rained. It felt secluded, too secluded in hindsight. I set up my tent, laid out my sleeping bag, stacked some firewood I gathered, and made myself something small to eat before dark. The first night was calm. I lay in the tent, half zipped open to let some air in, listening to the constant buzz of cicadas and the occasional plop of something falling into the creek. I didn't fall asleep right away, but eventually the fatigue from the drive and the heat pulled me under. The second day, I hiked deeper into the woods. The trails weren't marked well, and I ended up wandering farther than I intended. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, like dry branches snapping, but every time I turned around, the trees just stood there in their thick summer green. I told myself it was deer or maybe a raccoon. By mid-afternoon, I made it back to camp, sweaty and thirsty, but glad to see my tent still there exactly as I left it. That evening, I built a small fire and cooked some beans. As the sky went dark, I noticed something odd. Across the creek, maybe 30 yards away, the brush looked trampled. At first, I thought it was an animal path, but the longer I stared, the more it looked like fresh tracks, like someone had walked back and forth, pushing branches aside. It unsettled me, but I forced myself to ignore it. I figured hunters sometimes came through, and I wasn't exactly on private land. When I went to bed that night, I zipped the tent completely shut. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't animal steps. They were slow, deliberate, crushing through the leaves around my campsite. My heart slammed in my chest as I lay there frozen. The steps circled, then stopped. The woods went dead quiet. No insects, no movement. I held my breath, waiting, listening. After what felt like an hour but was probably 5 minutes, I heard the footsteps fade away, heading down toward the creek. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, staring at the thin fabric of the tent, every sound amplified. At dawn, I crawled out. Nothing looked disturbed, but in the dirt, I saw faint shoe prints. They weren't mine. They were larger, heavier, and led from the brush near the creek straight past my tent before fading into the woods. The sun made me feel a little braver, but I couldn't shake the image of someone standing outside while I slept. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave. It was stupid, but I didn't want to feel like I'd been run out of the woods. I spent the day closer to camp, collecting more firewood and keeping an eye on the tree line. Every so often, I thought I caught movement just at the edge of vision, but when I focused, it was nothing. That evening, I made the fire bigger than before, the flames giving me some comfort. I ate, cleaned up, and sat listening to the creek. The air felt heavier than the nights before, thick and still, as if even the forest was waiting. I eventually forced myself into the tent, knife tucked beside me, every nerve wired tight. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time the sound wasn't just footsteps. It was breathing, slow, deep breathing just outside the thin nylon wall of my tent. My blood turned to ice. I didn't move, didn't even blink. The breathing shifted like whoever it was had crouched down low, close to the ground, right next to me. I could hear the faint crunch of fabric as I tightened my grip on the knife. Then, just as sudden, the sound was gone. The silence pressed in heavy. I waited, counting every second. My arm cramped from holding the knife so tight, but I couldn't let go. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into a restless half-sleep. When the sun came up, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. My fire pit had been scattered, not by wind or an animal. The rocks I had arranged were shoved aside like someone kicked them. The shoe prints were clearer now, circling the tent, stopping inches from where my head had been while I slept. That was enough. I packed everything as fast as I could. My hands shook so bad I dropped the stakes twice. The whole time, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching. By the time I got back to the car, sweat poured down my back, though the morning air was cool. The drive out of the forest felt longer than the drive in. Every curve in the dirt road made me check the rearview mirror. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. When I finally hit the main road, I pulled over, sat in the car with the doors locked, and just breathed until my hands stopped shaking enough to grip the wheel. I never went back to that spot. For weeks after, I'd wake in the middle of the night, convinced I heard breathing outside my bedroom window. I replaced my apartment locks, added a chain, and even taped the seams of my curtains shut. Years later, I still don't know who was out there with me. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living off the grid, or maybe just a stranger who wanted to scare me. All I know is that it wasn't an animal. Someone walked around my tent, stood over me while I slept, and left without a word. That kind of silence is worse than anything else. It meant they weren't lost, they weren't curious, they were choosing not to be seen. And that's the part that stuck with me the most. Out there in the woods, there are no neighbors, no police down the street, no locks between you and whoever decides to step into your camp. Just thin nylon walls, a knife too small to matter, and the sound of someone breathing where they shouldn't be. I was 21 years old when I decided to take a short camping trip by myself in late October of 2012. I had just finished a long week of work in a small town called Redmond, Oregon, and I wanted some space away from everything. No phone service, no people, just the sound of rain and the woods around me. I had always liked being alone outdoors. It felt calm, simple, like the world slowed down and gave me room to breathe. That weekend, I drove out toward an area near the Ochoco National Forest, packed with thick pine and fir trees that stretched for miles. I picked a rough spot a little ways off the main dirt road, enough where I knew I wouldn't see anyone walking by. The sky was already gray when I set up my tent, and I could tell the weather was turning. I had a small two-man tent, a decent sleeping bag, a cheap lantern, and a cooler with some food. Nothing fancy, but it was enough for one night out. I gathered some wood quickly before the rain started and stacked it under a tarp so I could try to keep it dry. The air had that sharp smell that comes right before a storm, damp earth mixed with pine needles. By the time I boiled water on my little camping stove for noodles, the first drops of rain started to hit the ground. It wasn't heavy at first, just a slow patter against the tarp overhead. But I knew it was going to get worse. I ate fast, cleaned my small pot, and zipped everything up in bags so nothing would get soaked. When the rain picked up, I climbed into my tent with a book, laying back and listening to the sound of water hitting nylon. For a while, it was peaceful. The steady rhythm of rain hitting the tent almost made me fall asleep, but around 11 p.m., it changed. The rain came down harder, like handfuls of gravel being thrown down from the sky. The wind shook the branches above me, and every so often I'd hear the crack of wood, distant trees swaying and snapping in the gusts. The ground turned soft, sucking in water, and I felt little rivers starting to push their way under the floor of my tent. I kept shifting around, making sure my sleeping bag stayed off the edges where the water was seeping through. My flashlight beam caught the walls of the tent bowing in with the wind, and for the first time that night, I started to feel uneasy. I wasn't scared of storms, but I was alone, far enough from the road that no one would hear me if something went wrong. Sometime close to midnight, I heard something that cut through the noise of the storm, a sharp sound, like a heavy branch breaking. It wasn't far away either. I froze, my heart kicking up. At first I told myself it was just the wind, but then I thought about how saturated the ground was, how trees can give way in storms like this. The idea of a tree coming down on my tent made me sit up fast. I unzipped the tent just a little and stuck my flashlight out. The rain blew in sideways, cold and sharp against my face. The beam cut through the trees, rain streaking like silver lines across it, but I couldn't see anything broken or moving. Still, the forest felt alive in a different way, like it was shifting and pressing closer. I zipped it shut again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I shouldn't be in that spot. I tried to lie back down, but then another sound came. Not a branch this time. It was softer, uneven, footsteps in wet ground. My stomach tightened instantly. I held my breath, listening, every nerve on edge. It was faint, but it was real. The sound of someone moving slowly between the trees, not far from my tent. The rain should have drowned out everything, yet I could hear the squelch of mud under shoes. I told myself it could be an animal, maybe a deer, but deep down I knew it wasn't. Animals move differently. This was steady, deliberate, one step after another. My hand tightened around my flashlight, and I sat completely still. The footsteps stopped. The storm kept pounding, but I knew whoever or whatever it was hadn't gone. They were close. My tent felt paper-thin, useless, like one layer of fabric couldn't possibly keep me safe. I pictured someone standing just beyond the nylon wall, listening, waiting for me to make a sound. Minutes dragged by, though it felt like hours. My legs started to cramp from sitting so rigid, but I didn't dare move. Finally, the steps started again, this time slower, circling. My chest ached from holding my breath. I could hear water dripping off branches, mud sucking under weight. At one point, I swore I saw a shadow move across the faint glow of my lantern, like a figure passing by. I wanted to believe it was just my mind playing tricks, but the steps were too clear. I thought about unzipping the tent and shining my light out, but the idea of locking eyes with someone out there in the storm froze me in place. I stayed inside, listening, every sense stretched thin. Then, just as sudden as it started, the footsteps faded into the storm. It was hard to tell exactly when they disappeared because the rain was so loud, but eventually, all I could hear was water hammering the tent and branches creaking in the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the flashlight on, gripping it tight, flinching at every noise. By around 5 a.m., the storm slowed, and pale gray light began to filter through the trees. The ground was soaked, puddles everywhere, and my gear was damp, but I didn't care. The second I felt like it was light enough, I packed up fast. My hands shook as I shoved the wet tent into my bag, my eyes constantly flicking around the trees. When I finally walked back to where I had parked my car, my boots sinking into the mud, I stopped dead. There were footprints, not mine. They were spaced wider, deeper, and they came out of the tree-line, circling close to where my tent had been before heading back into the woods. I crouched down, my stomach sinking as I saw the tread pattern. Clear, heavy shoe prints. It hadn't been an animal. I stood there for a long moment, the damp morning air pressing cold into my skin, before I forced myself to keep walking. I threw my gear into the back seat, climbed in, and locked the doors as fast as I could. My heart was still pounding as I started the engine, mud spraying under my tires as I pushed down the road. I didn't look back. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I still think about it sometimes, about the sound of those footsteps circling me in the dark, in the middle of that storm. Whoever it was never tried to speak, never touched my tent, never showed themselves. But I know they were there and they knew I was too. And that was enough to make me realize just how thin the walls of a tent really are. I was 26 the first time I decided to go camping completely alone. I had done plenty of trips with friends before, sometimes even with my younger brother tagging along. But this was different. It was 2015, late August, and I was living in Colorado at the time. I worked at a warehouse in Denver, long hours on my feet, dealing with machines, lifting boxes, the usual grind. I remember feeling worn out with the constant routine. So when I finally got a 3-day weekend off, I thought I'd head into the mountains, away from everything, away from the sound of trucks backing up and the buzzing of fluorescent lights. I picked a spot near Gunnison National Forest, not too far from Blue Mesa Reservoir. I had never camped around there before, but the photos online made it look perfect. Wide open land mixed with thick patches of forest, enough space to set up without feeling boxed in. I loaded up my old Jeep with my tent, a cooler, a small propane stove, sleeping bag, water, and a few tools just in case. I left my phone mostly charged, but figured I wouldn't have service up there anyway. The drive itself was long and quiet. By the time I got into the dirt roads that cut deep into the forest, it was late afternoon. I remember how the sun was starting to tilt low, making everything golden through the trees. Dust rose behind my Jeep as I slowly bumped along the uneven road. I finally found a small clearing that looked perfect. It wasn't a designated campsite, more like an open patch of ground tucked between some trees and a steep slope that dropped into a gulch below. It was far enough from the road that I wouldn't hear passing cars, but close enough that if something went wrong, I could still walk back. I set up my tent and built a small fire pit using some stones I found nearby. The forest was silent except for the faint rustle of wind and a few birds calling. I cooked some food on my little stove and sat back as the sun went down. For a while it felt exactly how I hoped. Peaceful, no noise, just me and the wide open air. That first night was colder than I expected. I woke up several times, shifting around in my sleeping bag, listening to the sounds outside the tent. Twigs snapped now and then, and I assumed it was deer or smaller animals moving around. At one point, I thought I heard something heavier in the brush, but it faded after a while. I pushed it out of my mind and went back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee on my stove and hiked a short way up a ridge near my campsite. From up there, I could see the reservoir far off in the distance and the rolling tree line stretching forever. It was the kind of view that made me glad I had come. By the time I hiked back down, though, I noticed something strange near my camp. There were boot prints in the dirt near my fire pit. At first, I thought they were mine from the night before, but I looked closely and realized they weren't. The tread didn't match my boots, and they circled around my tent, not just passed through. I crouched down and studied them for a long time. They looked fresh, the edges sharp, not worn down by time or weather. I didn't know what to think, but I tried to shrug it off, convincing myself maybe they were old, from someone who had camped here before me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been near my tent while I was sleeping. That day, I tried to distract myself by fishing at the gulch below, though I kept glancing back up toward where my camp sat. The woods felt different. Every crack of a branch made me tense up. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, just a quick shift of something pale. But when I looked again, it was gone. By the time evening rolled around, I debated packing up and leaving, but pride got the better of me. I told myself I'd just keep the fire going late into the night, and maybe that would keep any curious hikers or animals away. As the darkness fell, I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, listening to the forest. I swear I heard something faint, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving in the brush, not crashing through it like an animal, but careful, measured. I held onto the hatchet I kept by the fire and sat as still as I could. The sound would stop for minutes at a time, then start again, always shifting location, like it was circling me. When I finally got the courage to go into my tent, I left the hatchet inside with me, close by. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little sound outside made me sit up and hold my breath. Sometime in the middle of the night, I heard the sound of fabric brushing, like something lightly touching the outside of my tent. My chest tightened, and I gripped the hatchet so hard my hand cramped. I stayed frozen, hardly breathing, waiting for the sound again. But after a long while, it stopped. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, and my stomach dropped. There were more boot prints around the site, fresh again, pressed deep into the dirt from the dew. Whoever it was had walked right up to my tent, circled it several times, and then vanished back into the woods. My fire pit had been disturbed too. The stones shifted slightly, almost like someone had tried to knock it apart. At that point, I was done. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving things into the Jeep without care. My hands shook as I collapsed the tent, scanning the tree line every few seconds, convinced I'd see someone standing there, watching. The drive out felt like it took forever. Every bend in the road, I expected to see another vehicle blocking the way or someone stepping out, but the road stayed empty. By the time I hit pavement again, I felt like I could finally breathe. My shoulders ached from the tension I'd been holding. When I got home, I told myself maybe it was just a hunter or another camper messing with me. But the truth is, there was no reason for anyone to be out there, circling my tent in the middle of the night, silently walking around while I slept. It's been years since that trip, and I still haven't camped alone again. I stick to public campgrounds now, places with people nearby, where the glow of other fires is visible in the distance. I never told many people about what happened, because it sounds like paranoia, but I know what I saw. I know what I heard. Out there in those woods, someone was watching me, and I'll never forget the feeling of being inside that thin nylon tent, completely exposed, knowing that nothing but a zipper separated me from whoever was out there in the dark. I was 24 the summer I decided to camp in a graveyard. It sounds strange when I think back on it now, but at the time it didn't feel like a bad idea. I had been traveling through rural Kentucky in 2015, taking back roads and staying away from busy campgrounds. I wanted quiet places, spots where no one else would bother me. I had an old tent, a sleeping bag that smelled faintly of mildew, and a cooler stuffed with cheap food and warm cans of beer. I didn't plan things well back then. I would just drive until I was tired and then pick somewhere to crash for the night. That particular evening, I had been driving through farm country. The sun was sinking, painting the sky orange and pink, and the road stretched empty for miles in either direction. I hadn't seen a gas station in hours. When I came around a bend, I noticed a narrow gravel path leading off to the right. A rusted metal gate leaned open, and behind it, I saw old stone markers scattered across a hill. A cemetery. It didn't look like anyone had been there in years. The grass grew up past my knees when I stepped out to look, and the stones were cracked, some leaning sideways like crooked teeth. The place looked abandoned. That's why I chose it. I figured no one would care if I pitched a tent there for one night. It wasn't the first time I had camped somewhere I wasn't supposed to. I hauled my gear up the hill, avoiding holes in the ground where the earth had sunk around old graves. The smell of wildflowers mixed with damp soil, and mosquitoes whined in the air. My boots crunched over dry grass and twigs as I picked a spot near a cluster of cedar trees. By the time I set up the tent, darkness was creeping in. Crickets buzzed loud in the weeds, and bats flitted overhead. The grave markers stood like silent company, their names rubbed away by rain and time. Some were so worn down they looked like plain stones. I remember kneeling near one marker and running my hand over the faded letters, trying to make out a name, but my fingers only felt rough grooves and lichen. I ate cold beans from a can and drank one of the warm beers, sitting on a flat stone as the night settled deeper. The air cooled fast, and the stillness was thick, almost heavy. Out in the distance, maybe half a mile away, I heard the faint sound of a dog barking. Otherwise, nothing. No cars, no voices, no movement except the bugs and the occasional rustle in the weeds. At first, the quiet felt peaceful. But after an hour, it started pressing on me. When you're alone in a place like that, your senses sharpen too much. Every sound seems louder. I heard twigs snapping far off and brushed it off as deer. Then a branch cracked closer, and I told myself it was raccoons. My nerves twitched, though. The thought of people popped into my mind. Teenagers messing around, or worse, someone who lived nearby seeing my car on the road and deciding to come check me out. I crawled into the tent just after midnight. I left the rain flap open to let in air, but I kept the mesh zipped. The moon was bright enough to light the field, and I could see shadows of the headstones through the mesh. The ground was hard under me, and I shifted around, trying to get comfortable. I told myself I'd sleep soon, but sleep didn't come. Around 1 in the morning, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps in the grass. My whole body stiffened. I held my breath and strained to listen. The steps stopped, then started again, closer this time. It wasn't an animal. It was too heavy, too measured. I sat up in the tent, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would shake the thin nylon. Through the mesh, I couldn't see anything moving, but I knew someone was out there. The sound came from my left, then circled slowly behind me. Whoever it was didn't speak, didn't run, just walked in a wide arc. I kept thinking about the fact that no one knew I was there. If something happened, no one would come looking for me. I fumbled quietly for my pocket knife, the only thing I had. It was dull, barely good enough to cut rope, but I gripped it tight anyway. The footsteps faded for a while, but then I heard a scrape, like something dragging across stone. I swallowed hard and leaned close to the mesh, scanning the graves. For a second, I caught sight of movement. A dark shape hunched low, slipping between the markers. I froze. It looked like a person crouching, trying to stay hidden. I sat in that tent for what felt like hours, barely blinking, my knife clutched in my hand. Every few minutes I'd hear another sound. Grass rustling, a faint tap against stone, the crunch of dirt. Whoever it was, they didn't leave. They circled, slow and patient, like they were waiting. At some point, I must have dozed off out of pure exhaustion. When I opened my eyes again, dawn was starting to bleed across the sky. Pale blue light spilled over the hill, and the cemetery looked different in the morning. The markers were just stones again. The grass just grass. Nothing out of place. I unzipped the tent and stepped out cautiously, scanning the area. That's when I saw it. Just a few feet from my tent, near a tilted headstone, the ground was disturbed. Fresh boot prints in the dirt, circling my campsite. Not animal tracks, real footprints, deep enough to show tread patterns. My chest tightened when I counted them. Whoever it was had walked around my tent at least 3 or 4 times in the night. I packed up fast, my hands shaking the whole time. I didn't eat, didn't stop to check anything else. I shoved the tent into the trunk, climbed into the car, and drove until I found a gas station on the main road. I sat there in the parking lot for an hour, sipping burnt coffee and staring at nothing, trying to settle my nerves. I never told anyone about it in detail, not then. It's been years now, but I still think about that night. Not the part where I heard footsteps. That could have been anyone, some farmer, a drifter, even kids messing around. What stays with me is the silence, the patience of whoever it was. No voice, no attempt to scare me off, no words at all. Just circling, waiting, leaving prints behind like they wanted me to know I wasn't alone. That was the last time I ever camped anywhere near a graveyard. I was 24 when I decided to take a short solo trip through Austria in the summer of 2016. I had been living in Munich for about a year, and on a whim I bought a small tent, stuffed my backpack with some gear, and took a train south into the mountains. I didn't plan much, just wanted to camp somewhere quiet, away from the cities, away from everything. By late afternoon, after a long day of walking along winding trails near the border of Styria, I found a flat patch of grass beside a narrow dirt road that cut through a dense forest. The road looked barely used, maybe only by the occasional hiker or farmer. It was far from any main town, just a few wooden farmhouses scattered miles apart. The place seemed perfect, tucked away, no people around, only the sound of wind in the trees. I set up my tent in a small clearing, the canvas looking tiny against the tall, dark pines. The air smelled of resin and damp earth. I boiled some water on my little camping stove, ate noodles, and sat against my backpack watching the light fade. The sun dropped behind the ridges, and soon the forest was wrapped in that thick silence you only notice when you're truly alone. By the time night fully settled, I lay in my tent, staring at the ceiling. It was one of those nights when even the insects seemed quiet. No cars, no voices, no movement, just stillness. I remember drifting off and waking again several times, restless from the hard ground. At some point, maybe around 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke up to the faint crunch of footsteps outside. At first, I thought it might be an animal, a deer maybe, or even a boar. But the sound wasn't right. It was steady, heavy, and slow, like boots pressing down on gravel. I froze, holding my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard nothing. I told myself it was my imagination. Alone in the woods, your brain plays tricks. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time closer. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Someone was out there, walking just beyond the thin sheet of fabric separating me from the night. My mouth went dry. I didn't move, didn't even shift the sleeping bag. I kept thinking, what if it was just a lost hiker? What if someone had a cabin nearby? But why would anyone walk around this remote road in the middle of the night? The footsteps stopped again, but I could feel it. Someone was standing there. I don't know how long it lasted. Could have been 30 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. Then came the soft sound of fabric brushing, like clothes shifting. I dared to turn my head slightly and peered through the tiny mesh window of my tent. First, I saw nothing, just darkness and the outline of trees. Then, at the edge of the clearing, I spotted him, a man. He was standing half in the shadows, maybe 15 or 20 feet away, not moving, just facing my tent. He wasn't carrying a light, wasn't holding any gear, just standing there like he had been watching for who knows how long. He looked tall, thin, and I could make out the pale shape of his face, even though the rest of him blended with the darkness. My heart was hammering so loud I thought he'd hear it. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct told me not to move, not to give away that I had seen him. I just lay there, staring through the mesh, barely breathing. After what felt like forever, he shifted slightly, turned his head, then walked slowly back into the trees. I waited until I couldn't hear his steps anymore. My whole body was shaking. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. Every sound made me jump. The wind in the branches, a snapping twig, the distant hoot of an owl. They all sounded like him coming back. I gripped the little pocket knife I kept by my sleeping bag, though I knew it wouldn't do much if anything happened. When dawn finally came, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The clearing looked normal, peaceful, like nothing had happened. The road was empty, the forest still. But when I looked down at the dirt near the trees, I saw prints, boot marks, deep in the soft soil, leading toward where I'd seen him standing. I packed my things as fast as I could. My hands were shaking so much it took me twice as long to fold the tent. The whole time, I kept glancing at the tree line, expecting him to step out again. Instead of heading deeper along the trail like I'd planned, I turned back toward the village I had passed the day before. It was a long, exhausting walk. I didn't stop to rest, didn't even eat. I just wanted out. The weirdest part is that the whole day, I kept feeling watched. I'd stop to catch my breath, look back down the road, and sometimes I swore I saw a figure far behind me, at the edge of the path. Not close, but always there. When I blinked or looked again, he'd be gone. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe my mind playing tricks, but it felt too real. By late afternoon, I stumbled into the village, sweating, dehydrated, and tense. People looked at me strangely as I hurried down the street with my oversized backpack. I found the small inn near the church and booked a room. When I locked the door behind me, it was the first time all day I felt safe. I didn't go back to that part of the forest again. A few days later, I cut the trip short and returned to Munich. I never told anyone there the full story, just brushed it off as a bad camping experience. But even now, years later, I can still see his face. Not the details, just the pale shape standing motionless in the dark, watching. That night taught me something I'll never forget. The woods aren't always empty. Sometimes you're not as alone as you think. I had been planning that camping trip for months. It was July of 2013, and I was 24, working long shifts in a warehouse, saving up for school, and desperately needing a break. A buddy of mine was supposed to come with me, but he bailed last minute because of work. I didn't want to waste the time I had already set aside, so I decided to go alone. I packed light but carefully: tent, sleeping bag, a cooler with food, a little propane stove, a flashlight, a hunting knife, a small hatchet, and my old .22 rifle I mostly used for target shooting. I picked a spot in northern Arizona, not too far from the Navajo Nation border, a stretch of land I'd only driven through before. The plan was to set up near a small clearing close to a dried-up creek bed. The land out there feels endless. Rolling desert hills, patches of pinyon pine and juniper, and at night the kind of silence you can't ever get in the city. I left before sunrise and drove 6 hours, the last 2 on a dirt road that rattled the whole truck. The sky was wide and cloudless, heat already shimmering by the time I parked. I set up my tent, unloaded my gear, and then hiked a couple of miles out to get a feel for the area. It was isolated, but not eerie at first. Just quiet, open land with a breeze that smelled faintly of sagebrush and dust. The first day was uneventful. I cooked some beans on the stove, sat in a camp chair, and read a paperback I'd brought. As evening fell, the temperature dropped sharply, as it does in the desert. The night sky was so full of stars it almost looked fake, like a painted dome overhead. I remember feeling small but calm. The second day I hiked further, following the creek bed until it twisted into thicker brush. I noticed tracks in the dust: deer, rabbits, maybe a coyote. Normal enough. Around noon, I climbed a ridge and looked out across the valley. That's when I saw something odd. A figure in the distance, standing still near the tree-line on the opposite ridge. It looked human at first glance, tall and thin, but too far away to make out. I figured it was just another camper or a rancher passing through, though I hadn't seen a single car or house for miles. By the time I climbed down and looked again, the figure was gone. That evening, I cooked some instant noodles and tried to shake the unease. But the memory of that figure stuck with me. The silence of the land felt heavier, almost like it was listening. When it got dark, I crawled into my tent and tried to sleep. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. At first I thought it was wind, but then I realized it was footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling my campsite. Gravel crunching, then stopping, then crunching again. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. I reached for the flashlight and my rifle, lying beside the sleeping bag. I forced myself to stay still, breathing shallowly, listening. The steps stopped just outside the tent. I didn't move. After what felt like forever, the sound faded, footsteps trailing off into the distance. I lay there until dawn broke, every muscle aching from tension. The next morning, I found footprints around the tent.
Bare footprints.
Human. They circled in uneven loops, stopping just inches from the fabric wall where my head had been. The prints were long and narrow, with the toes splayed out unnaturally far. My stomach turned when I saw how deep they were pressed into the dirt, like whoever or whatever made them was heavier than they should have been. I told myself it had to be some drifter, maybe high or mentally unstable. That was the most logical explanation. But even telling myself that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I debated packing up right then and heading home, but stubbornness kept me there. I'd driven all this way. I'd prepared for this trip, and I didn't want to admit that a little fear could send me running. So I stayed. The day dragged on, hot and still. I barely ate, kept my rifle close, and checked the Tyrol every few minutes. By evening, I was exhausted but too wounded up to sleep. I kept the fire going brighter than usual, feeding it with nearly all the wood I'd collected. At some point late in the night, I heard it again. Not footsteps this time, but a sound I still can't forget. It was a voice, a human voice, calling out from the dark. It wasn't words, not really. It was broken, like someone trying to remember how to speak. The tone kept shifting, too deep one moment, too high the next, stretched out in ways no throat should make. And worse, it was trying to sound like me. Took me a moment to realize that. It was my own voice, calling from the trees, mocking the way I breathed, the way I coughed earlier that day, like it had been studying me. I didn't move. I sat frozen by the fire, staring into the dark. The voice called again, closer now, jagged and wrong. My skin prickled with cold sweat. The brush at the edge of the clearing rustled, and I caught sight of something crouched low, just beyond the firelight. For a second, it looked like a man crawling on all fours, but the limbs were bent wrong, too long, too stiff. Its head jerked upward, and two pale eyes reflected the flames. That broke me. I grabbed the rifle and fired into the dark. The sound echoed across the valley, and whatever was out there shrieked. Not like an animal, not like a man, but something in between. I fired again, and the rustling snapped away into the distance. I stayed awake until dawn, fire burning low, rifle in my lap, shaking so bad I could barely hold it. When morning finally came, I walked to the Tyrol with the rifle still in my hands. I half expected to see blood, but there was nothing. No trail, no body, just more of those strange, heavy footprints leading off into the brush before vanishing into rocky ground. That was enough for me. I packed in a rush, tossing things haphazardly into the truck bed, leaving behind half my gear. I didn't care. I drove out of there faster than I should have on that rough dirt road, not stopping until I hit the highway. I didn't talk about it for months. When I finally told someone, I left out the details about the voice and the eyes. It sounded insane even to me, but I know what I heard, what I saw, and I know I wasn't alone out there. People always ask why I didn't call the police. What would I have told them? That a barefoot man who could mimic voices was crawling around my campsite in the middle of nowhere? They'd have written me off as some paranoid camper who spent too many nights alone. But I'll tell you this much. I've never camped alone again. I won't go near that part of Arizona, not even driving through. And sometimes, even now, if I'm walking home late at night and the street is too quiet, I swear I hear it again. My own voice whispering from somewhere it shouldn't be. I was 32 years old the year I decided to go on a solo hunting trip deep in the northern woods of Montana. It was the fall of 2014. The leaves had already started to change, and the air had that cold bite to it in the early mornings. I had hunted for years, mostly deer and elk with friends or family, but this time I wanted something different. I wanted to test myself by being out there alone. I thought it would give me peace, away from the noise of work and the city. I packed my rifle, a tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, and just enough food to last a week. I figured the rest I could supplement with what I caught. The drive out was long, nearly 6 hours from where I lived in Billings, but I didn't mind. The road turned from paved highways into rough gravel, then into dirt tracks that twisted through thick pine forests. I stopped once to fuel up in a tiny town and then kept driving until I was sure no one else would be nearby. I wanted pure quiet. When I finally parked my truck off a narrow trail and shouldered my pack, the world already felt different. The silence pressed in. The hike to my campsite was steep in parts, the kind that makes you feel every pound of your gear digging into your back. I had chosen a spot near a creek I remembered from a scouting trip years before. The water was clear and cold, flowing fast enough to drink without too much worry. When I reached it, I set up my tent in a clearing ringed by tall spruce trees, the ground covered with a blanket of fallen needles. It smelled sharp and earthy, like wet wood. The first day passed quietly. I built a small fire, cooked a bit of rice and canned meat, and took a short hike with my rifle to scout the area. I saw tracks of elk, fresh enough that I thought my chances were good. As night fell, the air dropped quickly, the sky going from orange to black in what felt like minutes. I crawled into my sleeping bag, the sound of the creek steady in the background. The second morning, I went deeper into the forest. I walked slow, trying not to break twigs under my boots, ears sharp for movement. I saw a group of deer at a distance but held back, waiting for elk. The forest was alive with small sounds, squirrels jumping from branches, birds calling, the distant rustle of wind through the trees. Nothing felt strange yet, just the ordinary silence of being alone. That evening I cooked what little I had, then sat by the fire as the woods darkened around me. The flames flickered against the trees, shadows long and moving. I remember feeling a bit uneasy, not from anything specific, just the natural tension of being alone where no one could hear you if something went wrong. When the fire burned low, I crawled into my tent. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. First, I didn't know why. Then I realized the forest was too quiet. The creek was still there, but everything else had stopped. The bugs, the distant hoots of owls, even the rustle of leaves. I lay there listening hard. My heartbeat felt loud inside the sleeping bag. Then I heard it, a heavy crunch, slow and deliberate, somewhere just beyond the tree line. It wasn't the light movement of a deer. It was heavier, like a man walking slowly through the dark. I stayed still, every muscle tense. The steps came closer, then stopped. I couldn't see anything from inside the tent, and I didn't dare unzip the flap. I lay there for what felt like an hour, though it was probably just minutes, until finally the sound moved off into the trees. I barely slept after that. The next morning I found nothing. No boot prints, no broken branches, no sign of anything. I tried to tell myself maybe it was an elk or even a bear, though the steps had sounded too careful, too measured. I tried to shake it off and went out hunting again, but I kept glancing over my shoulder more than usual. That day I saw almost nothing, no deer, no elk, not even small game. The forest felt empty, as if everything had moved out. I stayed out until dusk, then returned to camp uneasy. I built my fire larger than usual that night, keeping it burning long into the dark, as though the flames could push away whatever had been out there. It was sometime after midnight when I woke again. The sound was back, only closer this time. Crunching, stopping, waiting, then crunching again. I held my rifle close, my hands tight on the stock. The steps circled my camp, moving slow, deliberate, as though whoever or whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. The fire had burned down low, just glowing coals, but enough light to cast faint shadows against the tent wall. At one point, I thought I saw the outline of something tall move past, but it could have been my imagination. I didn't sleep again that night. By dawn, I had already packed most of my gear, ready to leave, but I hesitated. I had planned for a week, and it felt foolish to cut the trip short over noises I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just nerves. I forced myself to stay another night. That was a mistake. The third night was the worst. It started the same. The steps came back as soon as the woods went quiet. But this time, they didn't stay at the edge. They came right up to the tent. I could hear breathing just beyond the thin fabric, slow and heavy. The weight of footsteps pressed down, as though someone was circling within feet of me. My skin crawled. I held the rifle aimed at the entrance, finger stiff on the trigger. Then something touched the tent. A hand, or what felt like a hand. dragged along the fabric from top to bottom, slow, testing. My heart slammed so hard in my chest I thought it might give me away. I wanted to bolt, to run, but I was frozen, trapped in the bag, afraid that unzipping the tent would be the moment whatever it was grabbed me. It stayed like that for hours, or at least it felt like hours. The dragging, the circling, the waiting. At some point, exhaustion won out, and I must have drifted into a half-sleep, still gripping the rifle. When the light finally came, I unzipped the tent shaking. There were no clear prints, just disturbed pine needles all around, as if someone had carefully avoided leaving evidence. The air was colder than usual, the forest still silent. That was the final straw. I packed fast, dousing the fire, stuffing everything into my pack without care for order. My only thought was getting out. The hike back to the truck felt endless. Every step I expected to hear those heavy crunches behind me. The trees seemed to close in tighter, the silence pressing against my ears. My pack felt heavier than it had coming in, though I knew it was lighter. When I finally saw the glint of metal from the truck through the trees, relief nearly dropped me to my knees. I threw my gear in the back without caring, slammed the door, and started the engine. The sound of it was the first real noise I'd heard in days. I drove fast, bumping over the dirt track, eyes darting in the mirror. I didn't stop until I hit pavement again. I never found out what was out there. Maybe it was a person messing with me, maybe something else. All I know is that it wasn't an animal. Animals don't walk slow and careful around your camp for 3 nights straight. They don't breathe inches from your tent wall and drag their hand along it. Whatever it was, it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. I never went back to that spot again. Even now, years later, when I camp or hunt, I never go alone. That trip taught me something I can't unlearn. The woods may look empty, but sometimes someone else is already out there, watching, waiting, and not everyone you run into in the wild wants to be found. I had always loved the outdoors, but that summer of 2017 I decided to take things further than usual. I wanted to camp somewhere far from the usual tourist trails, somewhere quiet, with fewer people and more silence. I was 32 at the time, working a desk job in Vienna, and most of my life was routines and city noise. Camping alone in Austria's countryside felt like a good way to reset myself. I had spent weeks looking at maps, reading about small trails in the Tyrol region, and eventually I found an area not far from the German border, surrounded by thick forests and steep hillsides. It wasn't a famous tourist spot, which made it more appealing. I packed everything I thought I'd need: tent, sleeping bag, small stove, water filter, flashlight, extra batteries, and a decent knife. I caught a train to Innsbruck, then a bus further into the valley, and from there I hiked in. It was late August, warm in the day but already chilly at night. The trail wasn't marked well, but that was part of the attraction for me. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a flat clearing beside a stream, with enough open ground to pitch my tent. The sound of the running water was calming, and the trees around me formed a natural wall, almost shutting out the rest of the world. I set up camp, cooked a small meal of noodles and vegetables, and then walked around a little, making note of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. The forest was dense, the kind that swallowed sound. Even when I broke twigs under my boots, the sound didn't travel far. When evening came, the light faded quickly behind the hills. The stream's steady flow was the only constant noise. The first night passed without much happening, but on the second evening, as I sat near my small fire boiling water for tea, I noticed movement farther up the slope. At first, I thought it was a deer, since the forests here were full of them. But then I saw the shape more clearly. It was a man, standing between the trees maybe 50 or 60 meters away. He wasn't walking. He wasn't moving at all. He was just standing and watching, I froze for a moment, the way your body does before your brain catches up. My first thought was that he was another hiker. But most hikers don't just stand in the woods staring silently at someone else's camp. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and pants, but I couldn't make out details because of the distance and the dim light. I tried to keep calm. I went on with what I was doing, acting as if I hadn't noticed him, but every few seconds I glanced back. He was still there, not moving. Eventually, the darkness grew too thick to see him clearly anymore, and when I checked again, he was gone. That night, I lay in my tent, unable to fall asleep, every crack of a branch outside making me jolt awake. I kept my flashlight in my hand, my knife within reach. I told myself it was nothing, just someone passing through, maybe another camper looking for a spot, maybe even a hunter. But the way he stood there, the stillness, it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The next day, I hiked further up the valley, carrying only my day pack. I wanted to see if there were other campsites or maybe signs of people nearby. I walked for hours and didn't see a single soul. The trails were faint, overgrown in places as if rarely used. When I returned in the late afternoon, my stomach dropped the moment I saw my camp. Nothing was missing, nothing was broken, but I could tell someone had been there. My fire pit had been disturbed. The stones weren't arranged the way I'd left them. My backpack, which I had hung from a branch, was now resting on the ground. Small details, but enough to be certain I wasn't imagining things. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. It was too late in the day to pack up and hike all the way back to town. I didn't want to stumble through the forest in darkness, so I stayed. Cooked again, but I barely ate. My nerves were too tight. As night fell, I didn't light a fire this time. I crawled into my tent and kept the flashlight off, trying to listen. Hours passed. The forest was alive with normal night noises. Rustling leaves, the water of the stream, the occasional owl. But sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming from the slope where I'd seen the man. I held my breath, straining to hear. The footsteps stopped near my camp. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the faint shift of weight. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I didn't move. I lay there, every muscle stiff. The zipper of my tent was only a thin barrier, and I imagined it being pulled open at any second. The footsteps circled my tent, slow, steady. Then they stopped. I heard nothing for a long while. My chest hurt from holding my breath. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the footsteps again, this time moving away, fading into the distance until there was only silence. I didn't sleep at all that night. At the first hint of dawn, I packed everything into my backpack as fast as I could. My hands shook while rolling up the tent. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone watching again. The hike back down was long, but I moved quickly, barely stopping to drink water. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't care. I just wanted to be out of those woods. When I reached the road, I waited for a bus into town. I must have looked terrible, sweaty, pale, exhausted. On the ride back, every time we passed a lone figure on the roadside, my stomach tightened. I kept seeing that shape in the trees, that stillness. I never reported it to the police. What would I even say? A man stood and watched me, then circled my tent at night. No crime had been committed, nothing stolen, no harm done. But the memory has stayed with me stronger than almost anything else in my life. It wasn't just fear. It was the knowledge that someone chose to stand there in silence. Someone chose to creep around my tent when I was alone and vulnerable. That choice, deliberate and quiet, unsettled me in a way I can't shake off. I haven't camped alone since that trip. I still hike, but only during the day and only on marked trails where other people are near. At night, I stay in hostels or small inns, anywhere with walls and locks. Whenever I think about pitching a tent in the forest again, I remember that man in Austria, the way he stood so still, the way he walked around my tent in the darkness, and I know I won't ever feel safe enough to do it again. I was 26 the summer I decided to take a long camping trip through the backcountry of Montana. I had been living in Denver at the time, working long shifts and feeling burnt out from the same routine. I wanted a break from people, from screens, from traffic. I wanted to hear the wind move through trees instead of car horns, to see stars instead of streetlights. I bought new boots, packed food, my old tent, and drove north until the roads got smaller and quieter. By late July, I was deep into the Absaroka Beartooth wilderness, far from the towns and the crowds. I parked my truck at a trailhead that didn't look like much more than a dirt clearing and hiked until I couldn't hear anything but my own steps. The trail was rugged, and by the time I picked a campsite near a river bend, my shirt was damp with sweat. I felt good though, the kind of tired that makes you breathe deeper and appreciate the silence around you. The spot I chose was tucked between thick stands of spruce trees, with the river only a short walk down a slope. The water was fast, cold, and loud enough that it drowned out most other sounds. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and cooked a simple meal. When the sun dropped, the forest folded into blackness so heavy it felt like a wall pressing in. I lay down in my tent with my sleeping bag zipped up, listening to the constant rush of water. The first night passed without much trouble. I woke a few times to the sounds of branches snapping, but that happens in the woods all the time. Deer, squirrels, maybe even a bear moving in the dark. I reminded myself of that each time until sleep finally pulled me back under. On the second evening, I noticed something small but odd. About 50 feet from where I had set my tent, I saw fresh boot prints in the dirt near the riverbank. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked that far downstream yet, and these tracks were deep, like whoever made them was carrying weight. They looked recent, the edges sharp, not softened by rain or wind. At first I thought maybe another hiker had come through earlier that day, but I hadn't heard or seen anyone. The trailhead was miles away, and this wasn't a popular route. Still, I shrugged it off. The wilderness wasn't mine alone. That night, though, I had trouble shaking it. I sat by the fire longer than usual, watching the trees and listening harder than I should have. Every time the wind moved, I thought I heard footsteps mixing with it. Every crunch of a branch felt deliberate, too steady for an animal. By the time I finally forced myself into the tent, my stomach was tight with unease. At some point in the night, I woke up to the sound of water splashing. It wasn't the steady rush of the river, but something else, like someone wading through it. I lay completely still, ears straining, my heartbeat loud in my throat. The splashing stopped after a minute, replaced by silence so complete it made my skin crawl. I wanted to unzip the tent and look, but I couldn't move. I stayed frozen until exhaustion eventually won, and I drifted back into a restless sleep. The next morning, I walked down to the water. The river's edge was disturbed. Stones had been shifted and the mud showed prints, boot prints again. They came out of the water and stopped only 20 yards from my tent before turning back. I stood there staring, trying to reason with myself. Maybe a fisherman had come through. Maybe someone camped upstream and wandered down at night. But it didn't feel right. Nobody hikes in heavy boots through a freezing river in the dark without a light, without gear. The third night was worse. I kept the fire burning late, feeding it with every dry branch I could find. I sat with my back against a log, clutching my hatchet, eyes fixed on the dark beyond the firelight. Around midnight, I heard it again, movement. Not the random snaps of twigs that animals make, but steady, careful footsteps circling wide around my camp. They stopped every so often, then started again from a different angle, as if whoever it was testing the boundary of light. I couldn't see anything past the fire's glow, just black trees and shifting shadows. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the steps came back, closer than before, then fading, then close again. Felt like a game, like I was being studied. By dawn, my nerves were shot. I considered packing up right then and leaving, but stubbornness kept me. I had driven so far, carried so much gear in. I told myself it was paranoia, that the wilderness was supposed to feel raw and unsettling. Still, I couldn't shake the weight of being watched. That evening, when the sun sank, I decided not to start a fire. I sat in the tent in silence, hoping if someone was out there, they would lose interest if they thought the camp was empty. Hours passed. The forest was a wall of black, broken only by faint starlight. Then I heard it again. Soft steps in the dirt. This time they didn't circle. They came straight toward me. My throat went dry as I gripped the hatchet. The steps stopped only a few feet from the tent. I could hear breathing, slow, steady, human. I sat frozen, holding my breath, not daring to move. The sound lingered for what felt like forever. Then it shifted, retreating slowly into the trees. I stayed awake until the sky lightened, every muscle tense. When I finally stepped outside, the ground told the story. Prints surrounded my tent, fresh, heavy, deep. Whoever it was had walked around me in the night, stopping at the entrance, standing there long enough to leave marks deeper than anywhere else. That was it. I packed in under 20 minutes, tossing gear haphazardly into my backpack. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't even check the trail as carefully as I should have. I just walked, pushing myself harder than my legs wanted, not looking back. Every step I expected to hear another set following. By mid-afternoon, I reached the truck. My chest loosened the moment I locked the doors and started the engine. The feeling of safety was thin, but it was enough. I drove until I reached a small town and pulled into a gas station. My hands were still shaking as I filled the tank. I thought about telling someone, maybe the ranger station, maybe even the sheriff, but what could I say? That I heard footsteps at night? That I found boot prints? None of it proved anything, and I didn't want to sound like some paranoid camper. But I know what I felt out there. Someone was watching me. Someone walked around my tent in the dark, inches away, waiting for something. I never went back to that spot again. Now, years later, I still camp sometimes, but never alone. I always pick crowded sites, places where I can see the glow of another fire nearby, where I know I'm not the only one awake if something moves in the dark. Because I learned in Montana that the scariest thing in the wilderness isn't animals or storms. It's the presence of another person, one who doesn't want you to know they're there. I had been looking forward to that trip for months. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 23, fresh out of college, and badly in need of some quiet after what felt like years of noise. A few friends had invited me to a group trip in Italy, but I wanted something different, something that felt rougher, stripped down. I packed up my old car, loaded my tent, sleeping bag, and a few days' worth of food, and drove out to a part of southern France where the hills roll into forests that seem to go on forever. I picked a small camping spot far from the tourist campsites, the kind of place where you don't hear anyone else unless they're right on top of you. The weather was warm but unstable, and I liked that. The smell of rain on dry dirt always gave me some strange sense of calm. I parked my car at the edge of a narrow dirt road, shouldered my pack, and hiked a short way into the trees until the path narrowed and the branches overhead cut out most of the sky. The ground was uneven, covered in soft moss and leaves that muffled my steps. I set up my tent in a small clearing not far from a stream. The air smelled earthy, and the sound of the water trickling through rocks was steady, almost hypnotic. I boiled some noodles on my little camping stove, ate while sitting on a log, and watched the sun fade through the trees. felt good to be away from people. By the time night came, the forest had settled into that strange mix of silence and movement. Quiet until you notice every little rustle and crack in the undergrowth. I got into my tent and lay still for a long while before falling asleep. The first night passed without much trouble, though I woke up a few times to the sound of branches snapping. Normal forest sounds, I told myself. Deer, maybe wild boars. But sometime before dawn, I woke to what sounded like faint footsteps. They were slow, uneven, almost dragging. I held my breath and waited. After a while, they faded away. The second day was cloudy and cooler. I spent most of it walking along the stream, filling my bottle, and wandering into the thicker parts of the forest. At one point, I noticed cigarette butts near a tree stump. They looked recent, ash still clinging to the ends. I hadn't seen anyone on the drive-in, and I hadn't passed another hiker. It unsettled me, but I brushed it off. That night it rained, hard. The drops hammered the tent fabric so loud I couldn't hear anything else. I fell asleep late, but at some point I woke again. This time I wasn't imagining it. Someone was outside. The sound was muffled by the rain, but it was there, deliberate footsteps circling. My heart hammered in my chest. I didn't move. I just lay there, frozen, staring into the dark nylon above me. Then, after what felt like forever, the sound stopped. The next morning, I unzipped the tent slowly and stepped out. The ground was soaked, my boots heavy with mud. I scanned the clearing. That's when I saw them, prints. Clear, fresh footprints in the mud leading around my tent. Not animal tracks, but shoes. They weren't mine. I packed up my things fast and carried them closer to the stream, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But the truth sat heavy in my gut. Someone had been standing outside while I slept, watching. I didn't leave right away. Something in me wanted to push through, to prove I wasn't scared. So I moved my tent a little closer to the water, hoping the sound would drown out everything else. I cooked again, but my appetite was gone. The forest no longer felt calming. It felt tight, like it was closing in. Every tree seemed to hide something. That third night was worse than the others. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of metal scraping lightly, faint but unmistakable. It was like something brushed against my tent pole. My throat went dry. I didn't dare move. My sleeping bag suddenly felt like a coffin, holding me in place. I stayed like that for hours, straining my ears until exhaustion finally dragged me back to sleep. At dawn, I opened the tent and looked around. Nothing obvious, but near the tree line I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A small piece of cloth caught on a branch, dark and wet from the rain. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve. I stood there, staring at it until my skin crawled. By the fourth day, I'd had enough. I decided to pack up and leave. As I rolled up my sleeping bag, I noticed something carved faintly into the bark of a tree near my tent. 3 straight lines, shallow but deliberate, not random scratches. My stomach twisted. I stopped wasting time. I jammed everything into my pack, barely caring how it fit, and started walking fast back toward the car. The trail felt different. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was suffocating. Halfway back, I had the feeling I wasn't alone. That same deliberate crunch of leaves came from behind, faint but steady. I didn't look back. My hands shook as I tightened the straps of my pack and pushed faster through the brush. When I finally saw my car through the trees, relief hit me so hard my knees almost gave out. I yanked open the door, threw my gear in the back, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For just a second, I caught sight of a figure between the trees. Too far to see clearly, but tall, unmoving, just standing there, watching. The road back to town felt endless, every turn stretching into another. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the edge of a small village. My hands were trembling when I filled the tank. The attendant asked me something in French, but I couldn't even process the words. I just shook my head, got back in the car, and drove until the forest was miles behind me. I never went back to that spot. I told myself it was just some drifter, maybe a hunter passing through, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The footprints around my tent, the cloth on the branch, the carving in the tree, they weren't accidents. Someone had been out there watching me for days. That trip taught me something I've never forgotten. The woods are beautiful, calm, and alive in ways cities never are, but they're also unforgiving. Out there, you're alone no matter how prepared you think you are. And sometimes the scariest thing in the forest isn't an animal or some imagined monster. It's another person, someone who chooses not to leave you alone. I still camp, but never alone, not anymore. And every time the wind moves through the trees at night, I remember that sound, the slow, deliberate steps circling my tent in the dark. I was 27 years old the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip deep into the woods of northern Minnesota. I had been working long weeks in the city, and I thought a quiet weekend away would clear my head. I picked a spot near a small lake that wasn't listed on the popular camping maps. It was more of a fisherman's trail than an official site, but I liked the idea of being alone, away from crowds and noise. It was July of 2016, and the air had been humid for days, the kind of weather where storms build up without much warning. I parked my old Ford at the end of a dirt road just before dusk, slung my backpack over my shoulder, and carried a small cooler in my other hand. The trail was muddy in spots, and the mosquitoes came in thick clouds, but I pushed through until I reached a clearing by the water. The lake was calm, the surface flat and black like a sheet of glass. Across the water, pine trees stood in a solid line, their reflections doubling the wall of forest. The place looked perfect. I set up my tent near the tree line and stacked some wood I had gathered earlier in the day. The forecast had called for possible rain, but the sky was only slightly overcast when I arrived. By the time I got the fire going and cooked a few sausages, the light had faded. I sat on a camp chair, sipping a cheap beer, watching the ripples of fish breaking the surface of the lake. Everything was quiet except for the occasional splash and the buzz of insects. I remember thinking how peaceful it was, how it felt like I was the only person in the world. But that peace didn't last. Around midnight, the first drops of rain tapped against the tent. I had already crawled inside with a small lantern propped up near my sleeping bag. The sound of rain on nylon is usually calming, but this rain was heavy, falling harder with each minute. Within an hour, the storm hit in full. Thunder rolled across the lake, and lightning flashed bright enough to light up the trees around me. The wind shook the tent poles, and I could hear branches snapping off in the forest. I lay there listening, hoping the storm would pass quickly. Then I heard something else, something that didn't fit with the rhythm of rain and wind. It was faint, like the crunch of wet ground under heavy boots. At first, I thought it was just a tree limb falling, but the sound came again, slower this time, closer. It was footsteps. I froze. Out here, miles from any town, the idea of another person walking around in the middle of a storm felt wrong. I killed the lantern, leaving the tent pitch black, and pressed my ear to the side. The rain was pounding, but I could still make out movement. Wet footsteps circling through the mud and leaves, not far from where I was lying. Minutes passed, though it felt like an hour. The steps would come, then stop, then start again. My heart hammered so hard I swore whoever was out there could hear it. I tried to think of reasons someone would be walking around in this weather. Maybe another camper got lost, maybe a fisherman stranded by the storm. But it didn't feel like that. It felt deliberate, like whoever it was knew I was there. Lightning flashed again, and through the thin wall of my tent I saw a brief silhouette against the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving, then darkness again. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The rain washed everything in sound, but in the lulls between thunder, I heard the steps shift to the side of my tent. Whoever it was stood only a few yards away. I reached slowly into my bag and felt the handle of my hunting knife. My fingers tightened around it. I knew if they tried to come inside, I'd have to defend myself. Then, as suddenly as it started, the footsteps faded back into the forest. I lay there listening until my ears rang with the effort. Only the storm remained. Still, I couldn't sleep. I sat upright for hours, knife in my lap, waiting. When dawn finally broke, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. Everything outside was soaked. The ground turned to deep mud. I stepped out of the tent, exhausted but alert, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest looked normal, empty. But when I looked down, my stomach dropped. There were tracks in the mud. Large boot prints pressed deep from the weight of someone heavy. They came from the woods, circled my camp twice, and then disappeared back toward the trees. They weren't distorted by runoff either. They were fresh, pressed into the ground no more than a few hours earlier. Whoever it was had been standing right outside while I was inside listening. I packed my things as fast as I could, shoving wet gear into my bag without caring how it fit. My nerves were shot. Every crack of a branch made me spin my head. Every shadow between trees felt like a figure watching. I wanted nothing more than to get back to the truck and out of those woods. The hike back felt twice as long as it had the day before. The mud sucked at my boots, and my pack weighed heavier with every step. But I pushed hard, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Once, I thought I heard something trailing behind me, the faint snap of twigs. But when I stopped, the woods were silent except for dripping rain. I didn't wait to be sure, I kept moving. When I finally saw the dirt road and the shape of my truck, relief hit me so strong my legs went weak. I tossed everything into the back, climbed inside, and locked the doors. The keys shook in my hand as I jammed them into the ignition. I drove off fast, mud splattering behind me, not looking back until I reached the highway miles away. That night, when I was back in my apartment, dry clothes on, I couldn't shake the image of the boot prints circling my tent. Someone had been out there in the middle of a storm, not calling for help, not showing themselves, just watching. The way the prints doubled around told me they weren't passing by. They stopped and stood there. I never found out who it was. Maybe a drifter, maybe someone living rough in the woods, or maybe someone who had worse intentions. All I know is that they were close enough to reach out and touch the tent if they wanted to. I never went back to that lake. I still camp sometimes, but never alone, and never too far off marked trails. Even now, years later, every time I hear rain tapping against a tent, I remember that night, the heavy footsteps circling in the dark, and the feeling of being watched by someone who never said a word. That trip cured me of wanting solitude in the woods. Out there, miles from anyone, you realize how thin the walls of a tent really are, and how little separates you from whoever or whatever decides to walk up in the middle of the night. I was 26 years old when I went on a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. It was the summer of 2014, late July, and the desert heat in the day was crushing. But the nights out in the higher elevations near the pines were cool enough that I thought it would be a good place to get away for a while. I had been working nonstop, and I wanted nothing more than some quiet, no phone service, and the kind of stillness you can only get far from towns. I left my car at a dirt pull-off near a fire road and hiked about a mile in with my pack. The trail wasn't marked, but I had mapped it out the night before and I knew roughly where I wanted to set up. Near a shallow wash with a little opening where I could pitch my tent and still be surrounded by thick trees. It was a spot that gave me cover from the wind and some shade in the morning. I set up camp in the late afternoon. The tent went up fast, and I gathered wood for a small fire, enough to cook on and give some light when night came. The air smelled sharp with pine and dust, and the ground was littered with needles that crunched under my boots. A few birds chattered overhead, and I saw a jackrabbit dart through the brush. Nothing felt out of the ordinary. After eating a quick dinner of canned chili heated in my little pot, I sat by the fire and watched the sky fade from blue to deep purple, then black. The stars were brutal in their brightness, the kind of sky you only get far from towns. There was no moon that night, just endless dots of light. I stayed out for a while, poking at the fire, sipping water, letting my thoughts go blank. It was close to midnight when I finally crawled into my tent. The fire had burned down low, just embers, but I wasn't worried. The air was cool but not cold, and I zipped myself into my sleeping bag and closed my eyes. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. At first, it was the sound that pulled me back. A snapping twig, sharp in the stillness. My eyes opened to blackness, and for a second I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer moving through. I held still and listened. Another crack came, closer, deliberate, like weight shifting on dry wood. I lay there in the dark, my heart starting to hammer in my chest. Coyotes sometimes made noise, but this was not a pack yipping or the scatter of paws. This was heavy, slow. Something was walking. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make too much sound. My tent was thin nylon, and every movement inside it felt loud. I held the flashlight but didn't turn it on yet. I listened, then I heard it breathing. It wasn't the quick pant of an animal. It was deep, ragged, like a person who had been running but was trying to hold it in. It came from just beyond the thin wall of my tent, maybe 3 or 4 feet away. My scalp prickled, and every hair on my body stood on end. I clicked the flashlight on and shone it against the tent wall. The beam lit up the fabric, making it glow. I could see the faint outline of something standing there. It wasn't a clean shape. It looked too tall, shoulders hunched, head bent forward like it was craning toward me. For a long moment, it didn't move. I held my breath, frozen. Then, without sound, the shape shifted back and was gone. I waited, straining my ears. The breathing had stopped. No more twigs snapped. Just silence. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the flashlight, ears tuned to every sound. Eventually, exhaustion took me, and I dozed off sometime near dawn. When I crawled out of the tent in the gray morning light, the ground was damp with dew, and the air was cool. I scanned the area, half expecting to see footprints. And I did. Not animal tracks, but shoe prints. They were faint, pressed into the pine needles and dirt, circling the tent. Not boots like mine, these looked almost barefoot, but with enough definition that I knew they weren't. They were too long, too narrow, and the gait was strange, uneven, like whoever made them had been dragging one foot. I tried to brush it off, tell myself some hiker had come through in the night, maybe someone else camping nearby, wandering, but it didn't make sense. I had hiked in far, no other cars at the pull-off, and the prints weren't from regular hiking shoes. Still, I stayed. I convinced myself it was nothing and spent the day hiking, trying to shake the unease. I walked a long loop through the trees, climbed some rocks, and sat for a while looking over the desert spread below. By the time I got back, I was tired enough that I thought sleep would come easy. That night, I built the fire higher. I sat close to it, watching the shadows it threw against the trees. The sound of crickets filled the air, and the smell of smoke clung to my clothes. I didn't crawl into the tent until well past midnight, when the fire had burned low again. Sleep came hard, and when I finally drifted, it wasn't long before I was awake again. This time, it was worse. Something was moving around the fire pit. I could hear the scrape of stones, the shuffle of feet. Then a low sound, a voice, almost, but not words. Just a broken, guttural noise, like someone trying to speak through a throat that didn't work. My chest tightened, and I gripped my flashlight again. I forced myself to unzip the tent just enough to peek out. The fire pit was faintly glowing, and in that dim light I saw it. It stood at the edge of the clearing, back turned to me at first. It looked like a man, but off. The proportions were wrong. Arms too long, neck too stiff, legs bent in a way that looked painful. Its skin looked pale in the glow, almost gray, stretched tight. It turned its head, slowly, like it was aware I was watching. The face was wrong. The eyes too reflective, catching what little firelight there was, shining back like an animal's. I ducked back inside the tent, my hands shaking so bad the zipper rattled. The noise outside stopped. Silence pressed down on everything. I didn't move again until dawn. When I finally stepped out, the fire pit stones had been scattered, as if someone had kicked them apart. My pack was untouched, but the ground around the tent was torn with more of those strange prints, circling over and over again. That was enough. I broke camp in less than 10 minutes, shoving everything into my pack without care. The whole hike back, I felt eyes on me, though I never saw anything. The prints didn't follow onto the trail, but I kept glancing over my shoulder, gripping the handle of my knife like it would matter. When I reached my car, the relief that hit me was so strong I almost laughed. I threw the pack inside and started the engine, heart pounding until I hit the paved road miles later. I never went back to that spot. I told myself it could have been some stranger, some sick person living out there watching campers, messing with them. The prints, the movements, even the thing I thought I saw. I tried to rationalize it all. But the sound of that breathing still comes back to me sometimes when I wake in the middle of the night. I camp less now, and when I do, I stay near people. I don't go out into lonely places alone anymore. Whatever that was in the woods that night, man or something else, it wasn't lost, and it wasn't passing through. It was waiting, and I don't ever want to see it again. I was 26 in the summer of 2014, and I had been restless in my small apartment in Denver for weeks. I worked a desk job, and most of my days were spent staring at a computer screen. So I decided to take a few days off and drive out alone into the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. I wanted space, quiet, and the kind of air that didn't feel filtered through city traffic and office ventilation systems. I packed my old tent, a cheap sleeping bag, a small propane stove, and enough food for 3 nights. My plan was to camp near a small lake I had read about on a hiking forum, not far from a dirt road that wound deep into the national forest. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun was already beginning to slide lower in the sky. The drive had taken longer than I expected, and I hurried to pack what I needed into my backpack before the light disappeared. The trail itself was narrow and damp from recent rain, but it wasn't long, maybe 1.5 miles. By the time I reached the lake, the surface was flat and quiet, reflecting the last orange streaks of the sunset. It was a beautiful spot, surrounded by thick pines and a few jagged rocks on the far side. I set my tent up just far enough from the water to avoid condensation, but close enough that I could hear the soft ripple of it when the wind picked up. The forest felt peaceful at first. A few insects hummed. A bird called once and then fell silent. I boiled water, cooked a packet of instant noodles, and ate while the sky turned dark. I remember thinking how perfect it felt. Alone but not lonely, isolated but not unsafe. That changed later that night. I had crawled into my sleeping bag and drifted off, but sometime past midnight I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me out of sleep. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet, except for a faint rustling sound. I told myself it was wind through the branches, but the more I listened, the more I realized it sounded heavier, slower, deliberate, like footsteps. I lay still, holding my breath, listening as the sound moved closer. It wasn't a bear. I had camped enough to know the difference. Bears move with weight, snapping twigs, brushing against branches. This sounded like a person, the soft crunch of boots or shoes pressing down on damp soil, stopping every few steps. I sat up, straining my ears, my heart thudding so loud I swore it would give me away. After what felt like minutes, the sound stopped completely. I told myself it could have been another camper passing through, maybe someone heading to the lake. But the way it stopped right outside my tent made me feel sick. I didn't move, barely even breathed. I waited. Finally, after maybe half an hour of silence, I convinced myself I'd imagined it, laid back down and forced my eyes shut. The next morning, I stepped out of my tent and scanned the ground. That's when I saw them, footprints in the damp dirt. Not boot prints like a hiker would leave, but thin-soled shoes, almost like worn sneakers. They came from the direction of the trees and stopped not far from my tent. Whoever it was had stood there for a while, then turned back into the woods. No other tents, no cars, no campsites anywhere nearby. Just me. I tried to brush it off. People hike at night sometimes, I told myself. Maybe someone got lost or just wandered through. I tried not to think about how close the prints had been to where I slept. I spent the day fishing along the shore, hiking a bit around the lake, but the feeling of being watched stuck with me. Every time a bird scattered or branches shifted in the breeze, I'd glance up, scanning the tree line. I never saw anyone. By evening, I was uneasy enough to consider hiking back to my car, but it was late, and I told myself I was being paranoid. I cooked dinner, tried to relax, and forced myself into the tent once it got dark. That second night was worse. Around midnight, I heard it again, the same slow, careful steps. This time I knew I wasn't imagining it. I stayed completely still, clutching the small pocket knife I kept near my sleeping bag. The footsteps circled the tent. Not fast, not careless, but like someone taking their time, making sure to stay quiet. I could hear breathing outside, faint but steady. My heart raced, my palms sweaty on the knife handle. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. Silence. No more breathing, no more steps. I sat frozen for hours, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn seeped through the fabric of the tent. When I finally crawled out, the ground chilled my skin even through my boots. I looked again at the dirt around my tent. More footprints, the same thin-soled shoes, circling my tent this time. Whoever it was had been watching me, moving around me while I lay inside, pretending not to notice. That was it for me. I didn't even bother with breakfast. I packed up everything in a rush, stuffing my tent and sleeping bag haphazardly into my backpack. I didn't care if things fit or if they got dirty. I just needed to get out. My eyes kept darting to the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, waiting. The hike back to my car felt longer than the hike in. Every noise behind me made me spin around. Once, I swore I heard a twig snap not far back on the trail, but when I stopped and looked, there was nothing. I forced myself to keep moving, my chest tight, sweat rolling down my back even though the air was cool. When I finally reached my car, the relief hit me so hard my knees felt weak. I tossed everything into the back, slammed the doors and locked them. Only then did I let myself breathe. I started the engine, drove down that dirt road faster than I should have, and didn't slow until I hit pavement miles later. I never saw who it was. I don't know if it was just some drifter, some unstable person wandering the woods, or someone who had worse intentions. All I know is that they weren't out there by accident. The footprints proved that much. They came at night when I was most vulnerable, and they stayed close enough to hear me breathing inside the tent. I haven't been camping alone since. Even when I go with friends, I wake up at every sound outside the tent, my body tense, listening for those same slow steps. It's been years, but I still think about that trip, about how easy it would have been for me to disappear out there, and how no one would have known what happened. That was the first and last time I ever camped alone in the San Juans.